Okay.
Greetings. My name is Linda Reddy, a professor at Rutgers University. I'm delighted to be here at PCRC moderating a symposium on multiple methods of evaluation of teacher instruction and student learning with my colleagues here at Rutgers. Our symposium today is going to be spotlighting 5 distinct and complementary studies that look at common methods of classroom observation for evaluating not only teacher effectiveness, but also improving professional development supports. Across the 5 studies today, we're going to be focusing on utility and the validity of teacher assessment approaches, and importantly, student growth in reading from kindergarten through 12th grade students enrolled in high poverty charter schools. And collectively, these studies also embrace a multi-method assessment approach for evaluating effectiveness and particularly guiding instruction and classroom management to meet the unique needs of students in schools. My colleagues that will be joining me shortly are Christopher Dudek, who will be presenting study 1, which is going to be presenting on the concurrent analysis of 2 teacher observational tools, the Danielson Framework for Teaching, FFT, and the Classroom Strategy Assessment System. Our study 2 presentation will be with my colleague Nicole Wiggs, who will be looking at the convergence between taking teacher self-report ratings and school administrator ratings on the same classroom observations using the CSAS. Study 3 will be joined by Ryan Kettler, who will be doing a deep dive on the psychometric properties of the Danielson Framework for Teaching. And in particular, he'll be looking at the traditional scoring methods and the new proposed mathematical scoring methods for the Danielson. And in study 4, An Hon will also be presenting on looking at the role of direct instruction on young students' reading growth. And we'll be rounding out our symposium with a final presentation, study 5, by Adam Lekwa, who will be looking at student risk, the assessment of the learning environment, and database decision-making for screening. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Dudek, and I'll be presenting to you today on 2 different classroom observational assessments. My presentation, the concurrent analysis of teacher observation measures, compares the framework for teaching, that is the Danielson framework for teaching, and the classroom strategies assessment system. Again, the purpose of our study was to compare these 2 observational assessments to look at the concurrent validity between the 2 and to see how that relates to evaluating teachers' classroom performance. All across the nation, teacher evaluation over the last 10 to 15 years has seen dramatic improvements. One thing that has emerged in all new teacher evaluation systems is some type of standardized classroom observational framework or system. State departments, they commonly post an approved list of classroom observation instruments that school districts can then pick from and use. There's a big assumption, though, behind this list of approved instruments, and that is that different observational assessments, they are assumed to be providing comparable information, assessment purposes, and evidence of instructional practice. This, however, it hasn't been statistically tested, and this is a really big cause for concern. The new generation of classroom observational assessments, they have not had enough time or empirical studies behind them to demonstrate sufficient evidence to support statistical reliability and validity for using them to evaluate teachers in high-stakes settings. On top of this, there are well-known limitations of classroom observational assessments that these new measures are not impervious to. For example, we know that observational assessments are usually grounded in some type of theory of instruction. They have demonstrated different external validity differences depending on the culture that you live in. For example, East versus West. They have differences in terms of socioeconomic status and different types of classrooms, for example, general education versus special education. All these can contribute to limitations of the current generation of observational assessments. The problem that happens is when you look at how these are currently being used in our school systems. Most school districts and teacher evaluation systems rely on a single classroom observational assessment for all the teachers in their district. And so they use one instrument, one size fits all type of model to evaluate all the teachers in the district. So this has potential issues for how we evaluate teachers in high stakes settings. So my current study set out to examine and test this assumption of our two different classroom observational assessments that appear on these state approved lists. Are they the same? And my colleagues and I, we investigated this by asking what was the concurrent validity between a very popular measure, the Danielson Framework for Teaching, and another teacher observational assessment, the Classroom Strategies Assessment System. Our research questions for this study examined the correlational analysis between the Danielson Framework for Teaching's domains 2 and 3 and the related constructs on the Classroom Strategies Assessment System of instructional strategies and behavioral management strategies. Now, my colleagues at our symposium today, we are all going to be talking about the Danielson Framework for Teaching and the Classroom Strategies Assessment System in some form. So I'm going to give everyone a little overview of both of these assessments. The Danielson Framework for Teaching is a very popular teacher observational assessment. It's been in business for over 20 years. It is grounded in the constructivist learning and teaching model and was developed out of the Praxis 3, which is a teacher licensure assessment sponsored by ETS. The Framework for Teaching was designed to capture effective teaching principles across grade levels and subject areas and claims that it is applicable to all teachers. However, there is no empirically published evidence to support that claim, and there are actually studies suggesting that it performs different depending on its grade level and depending on the type of classroom, like general education or special education. How the Framework for Teaching works is, as a constructivist-based instrument, it is a observational rubric type of framework that supports effective teacher practice by promoting a shared understanding and dialogue between teachers and evaluators about effective teaching practices. It has 4 domains and corresponding and 22 base components that then generate at the end of a classroom observation, depending on what was observed, according to that rubric, a 4-point score in one of these 4 categories: unsatisfactory, basic, proficient, or distinguished, with unsatisfactory being the lowest and distinguished being the highest. The 4 domain areas of the Danielson are planning and preparation, classroom environment, instruction, and professional responsibilities. Now, in terms of teacher classroom observational assessments, classroom environment, domain 2, and domain 3, instruction, are the 2 most commonly observed areas of the Danielson. These are things that can actually be seen during a classroom observation. Domain 2, the classroom environment, has 5 components. Each of these components are nested under the classroom environment domain. They each have their own elements and indicators according to that 4-point rubric, and each of those elements and indicators contains a description, critical attributes, and possible examples. When observing, an observer is supposed to line up what the evidence they record during the observation to that rubric and rate these accordingly. Classroom domain 2 focuses on the classroom environment, and domain 3 focuses on instructional techniques. Previous research on the Framework for Teaching, given that it has a 20-year history, there have been some earlier studies back in the early 2000s, but they did not find evidence that supported the initial conceptualization of the Danielson. The more recent study and popular study that has found evidence supporting the Danielson Framework for Teaching is the Measures of Effective Teaching study. In that study, the Danielson Framework for Teaching was highly correlated with other well-known observational instruments and did demonstrate evidence with student achievement, although those results were non-existent to small, depending on the assessment that it was being compared with. Other large-scale evaluations with the Danielson have found similar small findings in its relation to student achievement. Our second measure that we're comparing the framework for teaching to is the Classroom Strategies Assessment System. The CSAS is a multi-method, multi-dimensional, and multi-informant classroom observational framework. It was developed through an Institute of Educational Sciences grant over the last 10 years. It is based on empirical literature from the effective instruction and behavioral management strategies realm. It contains instructional strategies from the 3 big models of instruction: opportunity to respond, metacognition, and classroom behavior management. Unlike the Danielson, it uses a different approach in that it is a multi-metric assessment or multi-method. It uses discrete counts of strategies, item rating scales, and a checklist that all inform and transform into similar 4-level ratings. Here's an example of the CSAS strategy counts, which are discrete counts of strategies that teachers are using. And so, for example, academic response opportunities on the CSAS relates to opportunity to respond literature. The rating scales for the CSAS contain 54 items, and its most recent version contains 60 items. There are 9 dimensions on the CSAS, and those 9 dimensions are broken into the instructional strategies domain and the behavior management strategies domain. How the CSAS works on these rating scales is there are 2 questions. There is a observed strategy and then a recommended rating. And those 2 ratings combine to produce a discrepancy score. The discrepancy score represents a need for change in teaching practices. In another way, we would expect teachers that have a significant need for professional development to be teaching less effectively, and teachers who are teaching more have less need for change in their practices. Across multiple studies over the last 10 years, the CSAS has demonstrated sufficient evidence for its internal structure and reliability. It has convergent validity with the classroom assessment scoring system, and as I'll show you in a little bit, with the framework for teaching. It has also been compared with other student assessments and demonstrates evidence for predicting student achievement on multiple types of standardized testing, including PARCC and MAP. It's also been used in 2 instructional coaching RCTs to improve teaching practices. So just to get back to my current study, we are again looking at the concurrent validity between the framework for teaching and the Danielson, the framework for teaching and the classroom strategies assessment system. Specifically, we're comparing how instruction on the CSAS matches up with instruction and classroom environment on the framework for teaching, and how behavior management on the CSAS matches up with those 2 domains on the Danielson. In our study, we had 221 participating classroom teachers that were about middle-aged, who were observed by their school administrators as part of routine teacher evaluation procedures in their schools. Each teacher received 3 observations per year with the CSAS and the framework for teaching that were conducted at the same time by their classroom administrator. At the end, we aggregated the scores together for each instrument and then correlated the 2 measures together. First table that we have here looks at the classroom environment for the Danielson framework for teaching, domain 2, and compares it to the CSAS strategy counts. What we found here is that our correlational strength with the CSAS strategy counts was varied with a mix of non-existent to small and moderate correlations. Most importantly, we found that similar constructs on the CSAS matched with similar constructs on the framework for teaching. For example, we see here that the behavior management strategies of clear directives, vague directives, behavior praise, and behavior corrective feedback tend to have stronger correlations with domain 2 than on the domain 3 scores for the Danielson, which I'll show you in a second. Here's our domain 3 scores for the Danielson. As we were saying, the behavior management on the CSAS had stronger scores with the framework for teaching domain 2 classroom environment. The reverse is true also for the instructional strategies here on the CSAS, concept summaries, academic response opportunities. They have stronger correlations with domain 3 instruction on the Danielson. We found a similar pattern in terms of the CSAS rating scales. Correlations tended to be stronger for the behavior management rating scale on the CSAS with domain 2 classroom environment on the framework for teaching. Overall, our correlational strength on the rating scales was in the moderate to large range, with a few that can be noted as weak correlations. Although this suggests comparability between the two instruments, there are differences in these two assessments. Here again are the correlations for domain, this is domain 3, the instructional side of the Danielson, relating to the CSAS. And again, we tend to have stronger correlations between the instructional strategies on CSAS and domain 3. So overall, our study found evidence to support the concurrent validity between the two measures, but we also have evidence of convergent and divergent validity between the two. In general, conceptually similar constructs were in the anticipated directions and greater magnitude compared to dissimilar constructs. For example, the CSAS strategy counts, they use a different metric than an observational rubric like the Danielson, and there were, in that case, some correlations that were non-existent or very small. The CSAS and the framework for teaching, they both generate unique and complementary information that can be used to evaluate and support teachers' professional growth. For example, the CSAS strategy count provides very discrete and distinct information compared to a broader observational rubric like the Danielson. This difference in construct specificity may combine to greater inform professional development, other aspects of teacher evaluation, and can help develop professional supports for teachers. Evaluation efforts that identify practice strengths and areas of improvement for teachers is really important, but observers tend to struggle identifying and helping those who are kind of in the middle of the spectrum. Combining an assessment that has maybe a global rubric rating like the framework for teaching and something that's more specific like CSAS could allow us to disentangle that middle ground of teachers and provide more targeted supports and professional developments. The use of multiple observational instruments can help mitigate potential biases when relying on a single observation instrument alone. That's a benefit of combining something that might be more broad and global versus something that might be more narrow and specific. And data in the current study does address the question of, does one size fits all approach to measuring teacher effectiveness? Although we found the two to be comparable, we did find that they have some differences, which potentially indicates that not all teachers should be measured the same. Again, just want to reiterate that global and specific measurement of evidence-based practices are really important for both performance evaluation of teachers and professional development efforts. Many teachers, grades K through 12, they struggle with classroom behavior management, and using instruments that may tap different areas of that area of instruction and classroom environment might be helpful for helping them improve their practices. And lastly, I'd like to conclude that in our study, we found the importance of classroom management to be very critical on both scales in its relationship to the instructional aspects of both measures. Regardless of whether you are having effective instruction or not, classroom management appears to be an essential component of creating a productive classroom environment. Thank you. And coming up next is my colleague, Nicole Wiggs.
Hi, I am Nicole Wiggs. Thank you, Chris, for introducing the FFT and the CSAS. So my study focuses on the CSAS, so the convergence between the teacher self-report and school administrator observations. The purpose of this study was to evaluate the convergence between teacher self-report and school administrator ratings of classroom instructional behavior management practices using the CSAS. This builds upon previous literature by examining the classroom environment from both the teachers and the school administrator's perspective. I'm also using a multi-trait, multi-method matrix, or MTMM, to further establish construct validity. The This also looks at the relationships between discrepancy scores, which Chris did an awesome job explaining the discrepancy scores, which are a difference between the recommended frequency ratings and the observed frequency ratings, indicating a need for change. I asked 2 research questions. The first is, what is the association between school administrator and teacher ratings of classroom instructional and behavior management practices using the CSAS? And the second is, what is the overall effectiveness of classroom teachers as measured by school administrator observation and teacher self-report? 3 hypotheses were evaluated using these 2 research questions. The first is that school administrator and teacher ratings of classroom practices will be small to moderate, which is consistent with previous teacher evaluation inter-rater correlational research. The second is that using that MTMM framework, we hypothesized that within trait, so specific practice correlations would be greater than within rater correlations, so the teacher versus the school administrator. And the final hypothesis states that variability between teacher self-report and school administrator ratings on behavior management and instructional practices in the classroom exist, which is consistent with that small to moderate strength correlation between raters. I also use participants were pulled from cohorts 3 to 5 of the SSI project, so 249 teachers and 30 corresponding school administrator observers in high poverty charter schools were included in the sample. The measure was a CSAS. I used both the teacher self-report form and the observer form. And again, discrepancy scores were used for all analyses. So another thing about the participants in this project, as Chris mentioned, the observations occurred 3 times per year. In order to participate in this particular study, I required that the observations and teacher self-reports be concurrently exist at all 3 times of participation. So let's look at the results. So as you can see, there were small significant correlations found between raters on all items. The total score correlations are what you're seeing on the slide right now. And when looking at the composite and the subscale level correlations, those were pretty consistent with the total score correlations. The highest correlations were found when measuring behavior management strategies, which you can see right here in the total score. So the behavior management strategy total score, the correlation was 0.27, and these were higher throughout than the instructional strategies, where the total score is 0.19. And this is also found on the composite and the subscale level correlations as well. So for that multi-trait, multi-method analyses, what we were looking for is for homo trait, hetero rater. So the same trait, different raters, to be higher than the other correlations. And that was found pretty much across the board. There was only one hetero trait correlation that was found to be the same as the homo trait correlation, and that's right here on the monitoring and feedback composite. But pretty much everywhere else, the highest Pearson correlation was found using the same trait, different raters, which is what we were looking for. So that does provide additional support for concurrent validity between the CSAS teacher self-report and the CSAS observer rating forms. I also ran t-tests, which didn't yield any significant difference between means for the total or the composite scores. There were 5 subscale scores with significant mean differences, and those subscales were student-directed instruction, direct instruction, proactive measures, directives, and behavior corrective feedback. Across all 5 of those, the teacher discrepancy scores were higher than the observer ratings, which indicated that teachers indicated a higher need for change in their own practices than the observers saw during the observation. I also looked at effectiveness ratings, which were guided by the CSAS guidelines there, because in general, schools tend to dichotomize teacher ratings into effective and ineffective. The CSAS provides 4 groups, which is ineffective, partially effective, effective, and highly effective. So just a little bit more differentiation between, just effective and just ineffective. Overall, I didn't find any difference between ratings of groups. Teacher and observer ratings fell mostly into the effective category. And there were little anecdotal differences at the ineffective category, where teachers rated themselves as ineffective more often than observers. So 25 teachers rated themselves as ineffective versus 14 observers rating teachers as ineffective. But overall, most teachers self-reported and were observed to be at the effective level or above, which is good. So in terms of the research implications, the multi-trait, multi-method analyses allows for additional support for the validity, the concurrent validity between the teacher self-report and observer ratings using the CSAS. So ratings are more likely to converge when they're rating the same trait than rating different traits, which is what we were looking for. In terms of multiple methods for teacher evaluation, teacher and student outcomes are often used in the evaluation process, but when looking at teacher evaluation, research suggests the use of concurrent multi-method approach to evaluating teacher effectiveness, but typically schools tend to use observer ratings. They're favored as the main method of in vivo evaluation. However, observers can lack training and consistency in evaluations, which ultimately can lead to low reliability. But using observer ratings and a concurrent multi-method approach where teacher self-report has been emphasized by multiple national organizations and research, which is where the CSAS comes in. Our results support the use of the CSAS as that concurrent multi-method approach to teacher evaluation, which could better improve the evaluation process. In terms of practical significance, again, using the CSAS teacher rating form along with that observer form allows for the discussion of professional development needs of teachers between school administrators or observers and teachers, which research identifies as a goal of teacher evaluation. We're also able to better identify the needs and develop professional development that best meets teachers' self-reported as well as observed needs. Teachers self-report along with observational ratings, as I said, is identified as best practice in teacher evaluation, but there is that research to practice gap that can be reduced through the use of the CSAS as a measure of self-report along with the observer ratings. And that's, kind of what our results suggest, that the CSAS observer form and the CSAS teacher form work in conjunction to better understand teacher practices, which is helpful. And finally, often teacher evaluation is dichotomized in practice to either effective or ineffective, as I mentioned. And given this dichotomization, teachers tend to predict themselves to be ineffective as well as their peers, even though their evaluation results often find them to be effective. The dichotomization reduces the ability to be able to discuss those professional development needs, which is a goal of teacher evaluation. And observers can often feel uncomfortable rating teachers as ineffective because of the high turnover rates, burnout, and being inconsistent in ratings that exist within the school. But by using the CSAS, we have quantitative results that fit into this dichotomization that schools tend to use in the teacher evaluation process. So by using the CSAS in schools, it can allow for an actual discussion while fitting into the common dichotomization that evaluation processes sometimes use in the schools, while having the quantitative backing to allow for that better discussion for professional development. All right, so that is it for me. I'm going to hand over the presentation.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you everybody for joining. I'm going to talk about theory, internal structure, and Danielson's framework for teaching, and specifically comparing a new composite scoring method for the Danielson framework for teaching to compare with its traditional, more global scores. So I'm going to talk about 3 studies that were part of the SSI project using the same longitudinal sample, same schools that have been discussed in some of these other projects. I'm going to explore a systematic scoring alternative for the Danielson framework. An observational framework that, as Chris described in detail, gives us typically ratings on 4-point scales in broad domains of planning and preparation, classroom environment, instruction, and professional responsibilities. Now, the Danielson framework was designed as a communication tool for communication between teachers and their observer administrators, and not as a measurement tool, even though it's subsequently been integrated into a number of systems of evaluation. And so what this study really gets at the heart of is, what if we use the Danielson like a rating scale? So we have this example here of 5 components in domain 2, and each of those 4 domains has 5 or 6 components that could be rated and used as 4-point ratings in what would typically be a rating scale. And then you would sum up those scores to get domain scores. And then you would total together the domains to get total scores. And then the measure would function more like a measure, in addition to being a communication tool and that type of thing, as it was originally intended. The idea then is that if we do a smaller grain size in terms of our ratings, get down to those components and treat them as items, then we're going to be able to get more stable ratings, more reliable ratings, and ratings that lead to more valid inferences. And so that would be the prediction. And we're going to go through a number of different research questions that are within the context of classical test theory, looking at the internal consistency and test-retest reliability or stability of the scores, and also the validity of the scores with regard to their relations to other factors and with their internal structure, how well the correlations match to the underlying theory for how the different components, domains, and total scores should fit together. So I am going to go through a number of different tables now describing the results from these studies that look like this. And typically the column study 1, Kettler and Reddy published a couple years ago, an assessment for effective intervention. And then study 2 the following year was looking at these same questions as a replication of study 1. And then the rows are broken down a number of ways. So in this table, the domains are the top half. All right, so that's domains 1, 2, 3, and 4, classroom environment, planning and preparation, so on and so forth. And then there's a couple of total scores that we considered. One being the historical total, which is the 4 of them together, or the whole quality of teaching in Danielson considered globally. And the other being just looking at domains 2 and 3 together, which, as Chris mentioned, are the more observable portions and are sometimes the portions that are included. And then we also have rows that are broken down by 1 round versus 3 rounds. All right, so these evaluations in the SSI project and in a number of these different evaluation systems happen 3 times a year, basically fall, winter, and spring. And so when I'm providing summaries of coefficients in the light pink area, we're talking about just 1 round. And then in the salmon colored rows, we're talking about average across 3 rounds. This particular slide is talking about internal consistency, the homogeny of the items using Cronbach's alpha. And as you can see, in most cases, those coefficients are approaching 0.9 or exceeding 0.9. So they're fine for making choices, making decision inferences that have higher stakes. There are some exceptions of some smaller, some lower alphas when you only use 1 round of analysis and you're only going at the domain level. So like with anything else, you're going to get higher alphas if you have more data points that are involved. Now, looking at test stability, test-retest reliability, I've only included the coefficients here when we went from 1 trimester to the next trimester. So this is only the coefficients for from fall to winter or from winter to spring. And looking across the 2 studies, we have the composites, which is the new type of scoring that I'm mentioning, which is adding up those various components to get total scores, or the more global ratings, which are in the salmon colored rows. And the differences aren't big, but if you look across and make comparison to comparison of the light pink versus the salmon colored, you'll see that the light pink, reflecting the composites, the new type of scoring that we're suggesting, do tend to be a little bit more reliable, as you would predict from time period to time period. This next question that we're answering in this table is a little different than the historical classical test theory. This is looking at the relationship between these 2 sets of ratings to see how interchangeable they are. At what degree do the traditional composite scores correlate with the, do the new composite scores correlate with the broad ratings? And you can see a lot of these correlations are pretty high, approaching 0.8, approaching 0.9, or exceeding 0.9. And so we know that this is a fine distinction that we're making because largely these scores are interchangeable. But if you want to go with a score and you feel like the composite score is more reliable because it's based on more data, it's more systematic and so on and so forth, you can see here that they can largely be inserted into a pre-existing system without seeing much change. We used a confirmatory factor analysis to fit the relations among the component items to 4-factor models for those 4 domain scores. And we found a much better fit after 3 rounds compared to just using 1 round of scores. So for that internal structure validity, now you have a p-value of 0.99. You have fit indices that are approaching 1.0 that are higher than 0.95. And so that's going to show you that if you want to rely on that match to underlying theory, then you would want to use those 3 sets of scores together. And then we looked at relations to achievement scores, and those relations didn't tend to be as high as one would hope, or in order to use the scores interchangeably with the ratings. Sometimes they approached 0.5, they didn't often get higher than that. But again, if you look at the pattern between the light pink and the salmon ratings, you'll see that the light pink composite scores did tend to be higher on average than the salmon scores did. Okay, so our take home, alphas and correlations between scores tend to be higher for the totals, or when you're using 3 rounds of scores. So when you're using the composites or using more data points. Composites tend to be more stable than ratings in terms of test-retest reliability. Internal structure tends to stabilize when we use an average of the 3 rounds together. Some of the composites predict achievement better than the ratings do, although it's on a level where you want to supplement these scores with achievements and not use them to replace achievement scores. In terms of practice, we see that the composites and the ratings are largely interchangeable, so it can be a matter of preference. Composites are probably more appropriate for progress monitoring because they have that test-retest stability. We see that there's a better match to theory if we use 3 rounds of ratings, which would indicate that if we're doing a higher stakes, like a summative evaluation, we want to use 3 rounds, which is typical. And as I mentioned, for formative ratings or for progress monitoring, the 1 round is probably appropriate. All right, and so thank you again, and I'm going to pass the screen to my colleague An Hua.
Hi, the topic of my talk is longitudinal analysis of direct instruction on students' reading growth. There are 2 main research questions. The first one is direct instruction, or DI, associated with students' reading growth within grade level? And we're looking at students' reading performance from 2nd through 4th grade, so it's a longitudinal sample. And there's a general consensus in the literature that DI is effective, especially in early readers. So we're hoping to replicate that finding in our sample. But the question of interest is, does the association between DI and reading growth change across development? So there's reason to think that the effectiveness of DI on reading growth may diminish over time. In the early grades, instruction primarily focuses on word decoding, and this is where explicit instruction on the rules that link sounds to letters may be especially important. But sometime around 4th grade, instruction becomes more meaning focused, and the ability to comprehend a text hinges not just on students' ability to decode words, but also their ability to extract meaning at the sentence and text level. When the shift of instruction goes from learning to read to reading to learn, DI may not exert as much influence. So what is DI? We conceptualize it as a general approach to classroom instruction where teachers direct students' learning. It typically involves a target skill being broken down into specific steps or tasks. Students are taught each component of the task associated with the target skill, and teacher models the target skill, provides practice and feedback at each step, and assesses whether reteaching is necessary. Our sample includes 269 students from 2nd through 4th grade, 74 teachers, and 10 schools. Reading was assessed via the Measures of Academic Progress, or MAP, by the MWEA, and teachers' direct instruction quality was assessed by the CSAS in the form of discrepancy scores. Teachers were observed 3 times a year, and students' reading scores were collected in the fall, winter, and spring of each year. So moving on to the results, as you can see here, across time points from fall of 2nd grade through spring of 4th grade, there is a gain of about 25 RIT points in students' reading performance, so that's great. Students are improving. And looking at the DI discrepancy scores, these are the scores of teachers who taught these students across 3 years. And looking at the means, you can see that they're very similar. And this indicates that the quality of DI students received was similar from year to year. Okay, so to address our main research questions, we conducted latent growth analyses. We ran 2 types of baseline models. One is just a single slope in the regression equation that characterizes the rate of reading growth per month of instruction for all 3 years. The second is a piecewise with 3 slopes, 1 for each year. This is because we hypothesized that growth was nonlinear based on previous research, where we expect students to accelerate at a faster rate during the earlier years. Because these 2 models are non-nested, we looked at the AIC values, and as you can see, model 2 outperforms model 1, and there's a change of about 100 points in the AIC. So this indicates that a 3-piece linear growth model was able to capture the data better. We then conducted 4 more models to compare them against the piecewise, which is model 2. In piecewise, the slope variances were fixed to be zeros for 3 years. And model 3A, we estimated the slope variances, but we allowed them to be equal to each other from year to year. And we compared the models using the chi-square likelihood ratio test. Model 3A, as you can see, when compared to model 2, it is significantly better, and this indicates that the slope variances were greater than 0. Model 3B, this is where we allow the slope variances to vary from year to year, and as you can see here, it outperforms model 3A. This means that the variability of growth was different from year to year. So far we've learned that a significant amount of growth variability was present among students, and this variability was different from year to year. Model 4A is where we enter direct instruction to explain the variability of students' reading growth. The effects of DI from year to year were constrained to be equal to each other. As you can see, model 4A explains the data much better than model 3B. This indicates that DI is a significant predictor of variability of students' reading growth. Now with model 4B, we wanted to estimate the effects of DI separately from year to year to see if its effectiveness actually changed, whether it diminishes across years or it stays the same, okay? And as you can see, comparing to model 4A, it did not outperform model 4A. So we think that overall the best fitting model and the most parsimonious model is model 4A. Here, looking at the regression coefficients for slopes, you can see that slope was steepest in 2nd grade and least steep in 4th grade. Looking at the effects of DI on slopes for 2nd grade, 3rd grade, and 4th grade, the regression, the estimates were negative 0.04. They are identical because they were constrained to be equal. But as you can see here, when they were allowed to vary, you know, it was not significant in 2nd grade, and they were kind of similar for 3rd and 4th grade. They're negative because we're looking at the relationship between discrepancy scores and students' growth. So the higher the discrepancy scores, which means the greater need for change on the teacher's part, the less students grew. So what does all of this mean? It means that DI appears to be equally effective for students' reading growth across grade levels. And this happens even in 4th grade, when instruction starts to focus more heavily on meaning extraction, both at sentence and discourse level. And DI strategies, as measured by the CSAS, are specific teaching practices that teachers can use to monitor and improve their instruction delivery. Thank you for your attention.
All right, start my stopwatch. Okay, it's so cool to be here at PCRC, here with you digitally, with my air quotes. I've heard it's a great conference, and I'm hoping I can join in person next year. So I'm Adam Lekwa. I'm an assistant research professor here at Rutgers University, and I want to share with you some results from a quick study we've done all about screening. And specifically, we're interested in taking into account the effects of different instructional environments as we think about students' risk in screening. So we know that we can understand something about students' probability of meeting grade level standards by measuring their reading and their math skills at various points in time across the year. Now we also know that different learning environments are not created equally and that these will impact learning. And so of course this begs the question that if these learning environments and the instructional strategies that teachers use impact learning, what does that mean about the about the decisions that we make about student risk and their need for intervention? And then if we find that association that measuring instructional environments shifts our understanding of student risk, what does that mean for the accuracy of the decisions that we make about students across different instructional environments? So to examine this, we got together a sample of 1,200 kids, 63 teachers, and 13 charter schools. Our screening measure were the measures of academic progress in reading and math from NWEA. We used the CSAS data that were gathered in these classrooms periodically throughout the school year. And then we used these measures to predict a yes or no whether students would meet grade level standards as measured by PARCC, ELA, or mathematics. To answer the first question, we fit a couple of multi-level models, and we found that after controlling for fall measure, this is a reading graph here, so after controlling for fall math reading, the CSAS predicted some additional variability in whether or not kids were going to pass PARCC. We also found an interaction where this association between CSAS and PARCC passage was a little bit stronger for kids that were in the lower range on the RIT scale. And in fact, this relationship was a little bit stronger yet for mathematics than it was for reading. So classrooms with a lower discrepancy score have higher quality instruction. Classrooms with a higher discrepancy score might have lower quality instruction. And as you can see, these two different scores were associated with the likelihood that students would go on to pass the test at the end of the year. So what does this mean about student risk? Well, clearly, if I'm a kid with a score of 180 in the fall on math, it really matters if I'm in a classroom that's characterized by a score of 6 on instructional strategies versus a score of 22 on instructional strategies. Now, to examine how this impacts the accuracy of the decisions that we make, we split the data set in two. We made a calibration data set and a cross-validation data set. We used ROC analysis with parametric bootstrapping on the calibration data set to identify an optimal cut point. That cut point ended up being a 185, just about a 186 in reading, maximizing sensitivity at 0.83. A little bit weaker here in math, as you can see with the AUC value, but we got a cut score of 183. Now, these do not take into account instructional environments. So what we wanted to find out was, if we apply these cut scores to the cross-validation sample, and then take a look at the accuracy of these scores for people that were in the first quartile on instructional strategies, that's higher quality instruction, versus the fourth quartile, lower quality instruction, what do we find out? And students that were in both of these groups, the different quartiles of instructional strategy use, had pretty much the same academic achievement levels, the same average and spread. So if there's any difference in classification accuracy, it can't be because of their skill levels. Well, here are the results. As you can see from the color coding off to the side of the graph, we've got significant differences in sensitivity, specificity, positive and negative predictive values, and a similar pattern here for math as well. In general, what we were finding from these graphs, you might want to pause and examine them slowly, is that for the classrooms with weaker instruction, there are a number of kids that we thought maybe would be okay, according to the model that's just using math to predict the likelihood of passing. and a number of these kids were not. They would not go on to meet grade level standards. Whereas in the classrooms with a much stronger instruction, we had an opposite problem where there was kids, and maybe it's not so much of a problem, but we had kids that we thought maybe weren't going to be likely to pass that state test, who ended up going on to pass that state test at the end of the year. So what are the implications? What we're looking at here is a different way of examining the results for the first research question. If the CSAS data had nothing to do with the probability of mastering state standards, what we would see is kind of a parallel bar of different color gradations across the graph. But there's a very clear bend in there, and what that means is that even if you've got a score that may be just above or just below the cut, it really depends on what kind of a classroom you're in. So what does this mean for practice? This means, obviously, and I think this is not a new message, that we've got to be really strategic about gathering information about what we taught and about how we taught it. And we should be very careful not to think about risk as something that lives just inside the kid. Because until now, that's the only way we've been treating risk, is by measuring student achievement and then using that to predict whether or not they're going to meet standards, or using that to define whether or not they need intervention. Clearly, there's a lot more work to be done in this area. I really look forward to your questions, your feedback, and your ideas, and would love to see everybody in person here sometime soon. All right, thanks everybody.